Russia continues to manufacture missiles in circumvention of sanctions, according to the New York Times investigators. Some of the cruise missiles that Russia fired at Ukraine's civilian infrastructure in late November were made months after the West imposed sanctions that were supposed to deprive Moscow of essential components. The ninth package of anti-Russian sanctions will include restrictions on the supply of technologies and components that Moscow uses for military purposes, Bloomberg reports. The EU is also considering restrictions on the provision of services and investments to Russia.
About 180 listings and targeting banks, media transmission and technology could potentially be agreed when EU FMs meet on December 12th. Rikard Józwiak, correspondent of Radio Liberty, on Twitter.
An embargo on offshore supplies of Russian oil to the EU countries came into force on December the 5th, and a price ceiling for Russian oil, which was adopted by the EU, the G7 and Australia, is already in effect. Western sanctions are still preventing Moscow from waging war, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says. According to him, the effect of the restrictions will soon become even more noticeable.
We see across the economy devastating effects from the sanctions that only grow, and in particular if you are looking at Russia's efforts to modernize its economy, whether it's energy technology, whether it's its basic telecommunications infrastructure, whether it's its defense and aerospace industry. Every single day that goes by with these sanctions in place, the burden on Russia gets heavier and heavier. Its ability to prosecute these kinds of wars gets weaker and weaker. Antony Blinken, United States Secretary of State, in an interview with CNN.
At the same time, there is a sector in the Russian economy that has not yet been affected by Western sanctions, and this is the nuclear energy sector. This despite the fact that the Russian army captured the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the first weeks of the war, and then the biggest, Zaporizhzhia NPP. Its constant shelling poses a threat to the security of the entire continent, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency. At the same time, the Kremlin's Rosatom, State Nuclear Energy Corporation, continues to build dozens of nuclear power plants around the world at its own expense in order to use them as a lever of influence.
Sanctions should be introduced both directly against the top managers of Rosatom and against those projects that are currently being implemented as soon as possible, because the very first task is to deprive the aggressor country of financial resources, which are then directed to finance the production of missiles, which then kill Ukrainian civilians.
Not only to impose restrictions, but also to create a mechanism that complicates their circumvention. The European Commission proposes to make violations of EU sanctions a criminal offence throughout the Union. According to the draft, which has already been submitted for approval by the EU Council, people and companies can face from a fine to 5 years in prison for helping to circumvent sanctions. The proposed directive will establish the same level of penalties in all member states. Thereby, it will close existing legal loopholes and increase the deterrent effect of violating EU sanctions in the first place. From the statement of the European Commission. It is expected that the ninth package of sanctions will be officially presented within a week. However, Belarus, which authorities do not prevent the launch of Russian missiles from its territory, will not be affected by the restrictions again. The package of new sanctions, according to the Financial Times, also includes a ban on the broadcasting of 4 Russian TV channels. EU member states are expected to approve the package at the summit of EU leaders on December the 15th. Reported by Diana Kolesnik, Yulia Bezborodko, UATV News.